Alberta Premier Danielle Smith defended her upcoming chat with the Daily Wire founder Ben Shapiro after Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi tried to claim she was meeting with a, quote, extremist. The province has also criticized the Liberals' electricity regulations, saying that Alberta will not comply. Smith similarly disproved one of former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's claims when he said there was no viable business case for LNG agreements after she struck a deal with Japan. Also on the show today, we'll be looking at two different statements made by the provincial government, one on the Premier's meeting on tariffs, and the other on a parliamentary budget officer report on the federal emissions cap. All that and more on the Alberta Roundup today. I'm your host, Isaac Lamoureux. Let's get the show on the road. So hopping into that Ben Shapiro story, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith said that her fireside chat with him will help bring Canada's message to an engaged U.S. audience as Canada bears the economic brunt of U.S. tariffs. Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi published his accusations in a release on Monday where he referred to Shapiro as far right. A spokesperson for Smith told me that the Premier was invited to a fireside chat with Shapiro hosted by PragerU in Florida at the end of March. Her itinerary is not yet finalized, and this event is the only one currently scheduled for her trip to Florida. The spokesperson said, quote, "A key part of the Premier's U.S. advocacy is advancing Alberta and Canada's message with the American people." They added that given Shapiro's millions of followers, his strong connection with U.S. President Donald Trump, and his belief that the U.S. should lower tariffs on Canada, the event will allow Smith to advocate for Alberta's and Canada's interests. That's right, you may remember Shapiro saying he didn't understand the tariffs placed on Canada. Nenshi was joined by other members of his party bashing Smith. MLA Janice Irwin reposted a post to X from an Edmonton Muslim group claiming that Shapiro was a, quote, racist, Zionist, and Islamophobe. Shapiro is Jewish and observes Orthodox Judaism. While the Muslim group used the term Zionist as a derogatory term for Shapiro, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs defines Zionism as the belief in Israel's right to exist. The CIJA said, quote, "Those who call themselves anti-Zionists in effect call for the destruction, whether by force or diplomacy, of a UN member state and of the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. Advocating an end to the world's only Jewish state is no less than a denial of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination." The CBC Ombudsman previously deemed it fair to link Ben Shapiro to extremists after the state broadcaster linked him to far-right extremism. The ruling came after Shapiro defended himself publicly against the CBC. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Alberta NDP aligning themselves with a group using this kind of language, and what you think of Nenshi's critique of Shapiro, especially in light of his distaste for the tariffs. Now switching to a different provincial story, Alberta's Environment Minister Rebecca Schultz and Affordability Minister Nathan Neudorf issued a joint statement on Thursday. They wrote, quote, "We will keep standing up for Albertans and continue preparing to oppose these unconstitutional rules in court, where we fully expect to win. Again." The statement followed a new report from the Alberta Electric System Operator, which showed that the clean electricity regulations would cost Albertans $30 billion between 2024 and 2049. The report also predicts that between 2035 and 2050, electricity costs will rise an additional 35% across the board due to the regulations. The Liberals finalized the clean electricity regulations in December 2024. The regulations set limits on carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel-powered electricity generation starting in 2035 to achieve a net zero electricity grid by 2050. The system operator concluded that the regulations threaten the reliability of Alberta's grid, increase costs, and fail to reduce carbon emissions meaningfully. The report reads, quote, "The CER sets an emission limit which is unattainable with commercially viable technologies. For example, best-in-class natural gas combined cycle technologies emit 5 to 6 times the CER limit. The CER as adopted fails to recognize practical reality." It added, quote, "As a result, by 2038, the CER would make Alberta's electricity system more than 100 times less reliable than the province's supply adequacy standard. Power shortages are predicted in the report by the mid-2030s if the regulations proceed." Albertan officials said they've already reduced electricity emissions by 59% since 2005. They said this was done without the regulations and that emissions will continue to decrease without federal interference. The minister said, quote, "It's clear the federal government's new regulations aren't actually about reducing emissions. Just like with the carbon tax, the real goal is punishing businesses, provinces, and families for using natural gas for reliable, dispatchable power." The report concluded that the regulations would result in significant risk to the grid with little to no actual benefit. The province's system operator wrote to the Liberals during the consultation process, warning them about the regulations. Electricity Canada also expressed profound concerns about how the regulations would endanger both affordability and reliability nationwide. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith previously invoked the Sovereignty Within United Canada Act to shield the province from the electricity regulations. The initial version of the federal regulations formerly proposed a net zero power grid by 2035. Despite delaying the timeline to 2050, Alberta previously said it was still unconstitutional and that any such regulations would be challenged in court. Schultz and Neudorf said it's time to reverse course instead of continuing down the path of costly and punitive policies. They wrote, quote, "Someone must fix the mess that Ottawa has made before it's too late. The next federal government needs to scrap these dangerous regulations and start listening to common sense." Now hopping back to the Premier, she secured a major liquefied natural gas deal with Japan, disproving former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's previous claim that there was no viable business case for such agreements. Smith and Ichiro Takahara, chairman and CEO of the Japan Organization for Metals and Energy Security, met on Tuesday and signed a memorandum of understanding between their respective governments. The new agreement reaffirmed Alberta's commitment to working with Japan to develop oil, natural gas, hydrogen, and ammonia resources. While discussing a potential LNG deal with Germany, Trudeau had previously said that there is no business case for such an agreement. Smith revealed that the project will move forward with implementing carbon capture and storage technology while utilizing other emission-reducing measures. The Alberta government expects the agreement to generate jobs for Albertans as well as attract outside investment to Alberta. Takahara said that the deal will, quote, "further deepen its cooperative relationship with the province of Alberta and contribute to the stable supply of energy and resources to Japan and the realization of a carbon-neutral society." Alberta and Japan first signed a memorandum in 2017 when the organization was known as the Japan Oil, Gas, and Metals National Corporation. It was last renewed in 2021. Bilateral trade between Alberta and Japan totaled more than $3 billion last year, making Japan the province's third largest export market at almost $2.7 billion, going from Alberta to Japan, nearly $1 billion of which was energy exports. Minister of Energy and Minerals Brian Jean said Alberta's latest commitment will allow Alberta to supply Japan with the most ethically produced resources in the world. Jean said in a Tuesday statement, quote, "We have an opportunity to supply Japan with the most ethically produced oil and gas on the planet to aid in their economy and shift to lower carbon electricity production while we continue to grow our international energy exports." Sticking with energy, the Premier and Schultz released a joint statement after a parliamentary budget officer analysis dropped on Wednesday, highlighting that the oil and gas emissions cap would reduce Canada's nominal GDP by $20.5 billion by 2032, along with wiping 54,400 jobs off the map. The statement highlighted that the PBO's report confirmed that the oil and gas emissions cap would cut oil and gas production by 5% or over 245,000 barrels per day. Smith and Schultz wrote, quote, "Alberta is working to diversify our customer base and get more barrels to Tidewater to maximize the value of our exports. But this policy is blatant hypocrisy at a time when Canadians are uniting on supporting a stronger energy sector. This cap must be scrapped immediately for the good of the country." They added, quote, "The evidence is clear. The federal government's proposed emissions cap is unconstitutional, bad for the economy, and bad for Canadians. We urge the next elected Prime Minister to abandon this extreme and ideological cap. It has never been clearer that we must grow and expand our energy sector as part of uniting Canada and ensuring a strong and independent economy." Yeah, we'll see what our new Prime Minister Mark Carney has planned for this oil and gas cap. What do you think him and his new Environment Minister have in store for us? Hopping into a quick statement released by Smith after Canada's premiers, or the Council of the Federation, met and discussed the ever-evolving tariffs situation. Smith said, quote, "I will continue to pursue a primarily diplomatic approach to dealing with U.S. and state officials, but will also continue to respond to any unjustified U.S. tariffs in a proportional and measured way that protects Albertans' interests. She added, quote, "It is clear that the American public opinion, industry, and U.S. leaders are opposing a continued trade dispute with Canada more and more with each passing day. We therefore need to avoid escalation, play the long game, and focus on getting to a mutually beneficial trade resolution with our American neighbors." Yeah, I just wanted to highlight this last story to ask you what you've thought of Smith's diplomatic approach versus other leaders like Ontario Premier Doug Ford actively threatening the US President Donald Trump and trying to engage in economic warfare with him. Also, now that Carney's sitting at the negotiating table, how do you think the negotiations will evolve? Let me know in the comments. Speaking of comments, let's hop into our comment roundup. Well, I just read through the over 300 comments on last video, which I appreciate greatly, by the way, and some of you may have already answered the questions that I posed in this video. For example, there was an overwhelming theme of support for how Danielle Smith has handled the tariff negotiations that have emerged thus far. But the first comment I want to highlight was more about the 51st state idea than the tariffs, which came from @lead9136, who said, quote, "Yeah, I don't agree with Danielle on the 51st. I hear from everyone they are all for it. Call for a referendum if Liberals win the next election. If Pierre wins, let's give him a chance at saving Canada, but I'm totally against any more equalization payments. They don't want to help themselves, then why should we?" Yeah, so a lot to unpack there, but I like that you referenced my referendum idea. Certainly a tool Smith might have in her pocket if the Liberals were victorious in the next election. That would certainly make for interesting times. The next comment I want to highlight comes from @BrahmsLee. "China has tariffed us heavily, on metals as well. Where is the outcry towards them like the US? A little fishy, I would say." Yeah, I felt like I needed to highlight this comment because of a lot of the rhetoric I've seen online about this very phenomenon. You're right that China has implemented, in some instances, more severe tariffs on us than the United States, but it seems as if these stories have been less popular and less prevalent than those of the United States. Why does it seem so much more publicly acceptable to hate on the US and Trump? Is China not a bigger threat? The last comment I'll highlight today comes from @AcesofBricks-AdamR5893, who said, quote, "I've never understood how leaving Canada to join the US would give Western Canadians a stronger voice over our own governance. We would still be a small fish in an even larger pond, not to mention that Trump's tariffs are meant to starve Canadians into submission. Since when has complying with someone who threatens you been a good idea? Just because they promise they'll stop the abuse once you've given them what they want. If they can't be fair and respectful now, they won't be later either. Western Canadians would be far better off separating into our own smaller country with strategic trade alliances and a much larger say in our own governance. The unlikely dream might be to have Montana, Idaho, and the Dakotas join us too." Yeah, so I wanted to highlight this one because it really got me thinking. You're right that if we joined the US, we would probably even have less of a voice due to our small population in regard to other states. But I think the argument is that if the US were governed by a pro-energy government like that of Trump, then Alberta would be more successful regardless of how small of a populace it is, because of the amount of energy we have and what we could provide to the US. It's like Jordan Peterson said, alluding to if the US could offer us a better deal than Canada. The Western provinces becoming its own country altogether would be an interesting idea. I wonder what kind of deals it would be able to usher with the US and what Eastern Canada would do without us. Anyways, there were so many good comments last week. It was very difficult to choose. I mean, I could genuinely sit here and do this all day, but unfortunately, that wraps up our comment roundup in this week's show. My name's Isaac Lamoureux, your host of the Alberta Roundup. Have a great weekend. Thank you and God bless. May Alberta prosper, strong and free.